Theresa May's deal demolished by MPs, handing the government the biggest parliamentary defeat in UK history. I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Brexit.
The ayes to the right, 202. The noes to the left, 432.
It is clear that the House does not support this deal, but tonight's vote tells us nothing about what it does support.
I have now tabled a motion of no confidence in this government.
Not a done deal! Stop Brexit!
Brexit's rubbish and we want it gone! Brexit alive!
It took Theresa May more than 2 years to get a deal with the EU and just minutes for more than 400 British MPs to dump it. The Prime Minister now has 3 days to come up with a backup plan to exit the EU and at the same time survive another vote of no confidence, this time triggered by Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. So as confusion swirls and the opposition strikes, we're asking what the future holds for Theresa May and Brexit. Sandra Gatman takes a look.
The ayes to the right, 202. The noes to the left, 432. So the noes have it, the noes have it.
Defeat was on the cards. But to many, the scale of opposition to Prime Minister Theresa May's Brexit deal was shocking. A picture of how divided lawmakers and the country remain over how the UK will leave the European Union.
We've got a Prime Minister who can't command a majority at all.
Parliament's rejected the best deal the Prime Minister could do.
But Theresa May is going to try again, and she's hoping to attract new allies.
The government has heard what the House has said tonight, but I ask members on all sides of the House to listen to the British people who want this issue settled and to work with the government to do just that.
First, though, she'll have to survive another vote of no confidence, this time tabled by the opposition.
This is a catastrophic defeat for this government. I have now tabled a motion of no confidence in this government. And I'm pleased that motion will be debated tomorrow.
May is likely to survive the vote, but she faces the difficult task of figuring out what MPs might vote for, not the deal she worked more than 2 years to put on the table. The deal MPs voted down was twofold. First, a political declaration that the EU and UK will cooperate closely on trade and security while ending the free movement of people. The second document they rejected was the withdrawal agreement, or the UK's legally binding divorce deal with the EU. It gave a 21-month transition period for the UK to leave, starting on the 29th of March. It also included a £39 billion or $50 billion bill to be paid by the UK, and secured the rights of EU and UK citizens living abroad to remain there. It also included the controversial backstop, a temporary plan to keep the UK in line with EU trade rules to avoid a hard border between the UK's Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, an EU member. Now, though, it's back to the drawing board.
I think the great unifying chart hit of today would be called something like, "Are you sick of hearing, reading, eating, breathing, dreaming about Brexit?"
Sadly for some, the Brexit drama isn't over. If she survives the no-confidence vote, Theresa May has 3 days to come up with a backup plan, and that could mean delaying the March deadline to leave the EU.
Extend Article 50, give us time to get through this impasse. It's really, I think, time for us to come together and recognise it is a crisis that the whole of the United Kingdom is in.
But skepticism is rife. Even if she breaks the deadlock in Westminster, will Theresa May see a change of heart in Brussels? So far, European countries have been reluctant to offer Britain any new concessions. The EU's Brexit negotiator even hinted they should prepare for no deal at all.
Today, 10 weeks away, the risk of a no deal never seems so high. Our goal is to avoid that scenario, but we will also have a responsibility to remain clear-headed, which is why we will intensify our efforts to be prepared for that possibility.
Analyst fears about a no-deal scenario include market chaos, food shortages, and endless queues as businesses on both sides work out how to trade. Some pro-Brexiteers, though, seem to think the UK will be able to operate under World Trade Organization rules.
Leaving to WTO terms is nothing to be frightened of. It's how we trade with the United States, it's how we trade with other countries. There's side agreements around it that are technical agreements that are relatively easy to put in place.
And there's another camp, still calling for a new referendum that might cancel Brexit altogether.
And just because you voted once doesn't mean you can't reflect and have maybe more options.
But May's government is strongly opposed to the idea, and it's unclear whether Brits would vote any differently. For now, this House has made its position on Brexit known, but the big questions still hang in the air. Whether the UK will leave the EU at all, the future of Northern Ireland, Gibraltar, and even Scottish independence. It won't be back to politics as usual anytime soon. Sandra Gottman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Denis McShane. He's the UK's former EU minister and author of the book Brexit, No Exit, How in the End Britain Won't Leave Europe. In Strasbourg, we have Stephen Woolfe. He's a member of the European Parliament for North West England and was once tipped to take over as leader of UKIP. And in Birmingham, we have Conservative Party activist Ali Fazol. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers once again. Stephen Woolfe, let me start with you. Did the House make the right decision to reject Theresa May's deal with the Europeans?
Absolutely. This was a deal that was not acceptable to leavers like myself, who believed that we should have a truly independent nation state capable of taking control of all our laws and negotiating trade deals with the rest of the world. And of course, it was deeply opposed by those on the Remain side because it didn't satisfy their reasons for being in the European Union, which is full membership of the single market, the customs union, and being part of a club that they feel comfortable and safe with in making decisions on our behalf.
So, Stephen, even though we are stepping into unknown territory and possibly much more chaos, was it worth it?
Absolutely. I think it had to be made clear to the Prime Minister that this withdrawal agreement was a nonsense from the start. She should have made a decision early on to tell the European Union that we would have gone to a WTO deal on a specific date, and then we could have worked towards a free trade arrangement. Instead, she tried to cobble together a halfway house deal that doesn't satisfy either side. And what she's done in the process, and this is the real danger to our British politics now, is that she has created the biggest constitutional crisis since the English Civil War. We now have the equivalent of Roundheads against Cavaliers. We have brought out one of the deepest, nasty elements of our society in England, which is snobbishness. It's a way of looking down on people that voted, and we have a battle between Parliament and those voters, the constitutional issue there.
Denis McShane, did she create the constitutional crisis or did Brexit create the constitutional crisis?
Both. I mean, clearly what we saw last night is the beginning of a giant fight between parliamentary democracy and the democracy. It's democracy of plebiscites. And plebiscites, one of the basis of lies. It's great to be on TRT because one of the big lies 30 months ago was that 85 million Turks were about to enter the European Union and come to England. Now, anybody in Turkey will know that's a lie, but we were told that. But what we now have is a fight between a parliament that doesn't want to destroy the economy, doesn't want to damage jobs, wants to keep Britain an open, tolerant nation, and a plebiscite vote, which is to cut Britain off, amputate it from Europe, tell Europeans they're not welcome here, bring British expats back from Europe. And in a sense, those two can't really be reconciled. And she, the Prime Minister, since day one of entering Downing Street, has only ever sided with the language of anti-Europeanism. If you're a believer in Europe, then you're a citizen of nowhere. If you're a European working here, you're a queue jumper. This is all the ugly language of dislike of Europeans, and in the sense she got her comeuppance yesterday. I don't know how the heck she gets out of this.
And Denis McShane, for you, the solution is no Brexit.
Well, I think the solution is that we should ask the British people. I trust the people They came to one decision 30 months ago, I believe based on lies, on erroneous information. Let's leave that to one side. We now have a lot of new facts. We really understand the implications and the damage to Britain's standing, status and economy if we amputate ourselves from Europe. We've also got a lot of new voters. A lot of younger voters have joined the electoral rolls who are very, very concerned about being denied their right to work and retire and live in Europe. So I just say, let us trust the people.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned young, new voters. Ali Fazal is our youngest panelist on the show here. And Ali, it's quite rare, and I mean this not disrespectfully, but it's quite rare to have a very young person who's a conservative on this show or anywhere else. You know, the joke is that you're the one conservative who skipped the phase of being a Marxist or a leftist in his teens and 20s and went straight to being a conservative, right? Tell me where you stand on this as a young Tory activist.
Thank you, Imran. Thanks for having me on the show again. And I have to say, it's not necessarily rare to be a young Conservative. We actually had more young people at the Conservative Party conference this year than Labour did at their conference, so we're definitely not rare. But where I stand on this is that the British people had their say. They voted to leave, and Parliament has to enact that. We have to leave the European Union. But that doesn't mean leaving at any cost. We have to make sure that we leave sensibly, not with a no-deal Brexit, but with one that protects jobs and the economy. And it was a shame to see Theresa May's deal not get through Parliament. I think it was a compromise. You're never going to please everybody. She was trying to bring together Leave and Remain. And it's a shame that MPs didn't support that. When you have a party with Anna Soubry and Jacob Rees-Mogg in it at the same time, you're never going to find an agreement where both can agree. And so it was a shame to see it voted down. And I think where we go from here is what MPs like Nick Bowles and Nicky Morgan and Oliver Letwin have suggested. The government has 3 weeks till the first week of March to go and to have a look at what Plan B could be. They then come back, present that to Parliament. If Parliament is happy with that, then fantastic, we move ahead with that plan. If not, then control of the Brexit process goes on to the Liaison Committee, which is the most senior committee in the House of Commons, and they take control of the process. They can then make amendments, form a new deal, and get a deal where everybody can actually agree, or at least majority of the MPs.
So, Ali, I want to bring in Stephen Wolfe. So, Stephen Wolfe, here you have a young Tory activist going, OK, it's not the greatest deal, but it's a deal and it's a compromise. Let's just get on with it now. Let's make the most of it. Why are you guys so heavily against it?
Because you're quite right. He said that the British people voted to leave, and that's an interesting point that, if I can go back to what Dennis had said. Dennis said, I really oppose plebiscites. They're really not a great idea, but now he wants to have a third referendum, the so-called losers vote referendum, which is indeed a plebiscite. But I'm going to trust that plebiscite if we can win. The key point about this is that we asked to leave the European Union, and everybody accepts that Theresa May's withdrawal deal does not leave the European Union. Of course, we do leave the institutions of the European Union. I lose my job as an MEP. You lose the Commission. You're not on the European Courts of Justice. But Theresa May's deal makes sure that the UK is bound by all European laws. The deal also suggests that we have the European Courts of Justice in a vast swathe of areas under our control. And the Attorney General in the debate yesterday, our most senior lawyer in the country and for the government, said we should be happy that we're returning 40% of our laws in agriculture and fisheries back to the UK. How can getting back control of 40% of our laws mean Brexit and taking control? That is why we're opposed to it. We're still tied into the European Union. Rule takers, not rule makers.
And Stephen, even though Parliament rejected the deal, the Europeans don't seem to be interested in a renegotiation. So what's going to happen? You just drop out and that's that? Deal with the consequences?
No, absolutely. I'm here in the European Parliament. I've been talking to a wide variety of people, from Mr. Verhofstadt, who leads ALDE, to Marcus Faber, who's chairman of the economic committees. All of them now still would like to see Britain remain in the European Union. That is their clear position. But there is a slight divide. There are those who say that they are not going to change this withdrawal agreement at all. That was the deal put on the table. Britain should accept it. But there is a deep concern that at the end of March, if we do not accept that deal, if Parliament in the UK doesn't accept the withdrawal agreement, they go to the WTO scenario, which they recognise fully is very damaging to European economies, particularly Holland, particularly Ireland. And as you heard from Macron in his speech this morning, there would be an enormous battle with France over fishing rights because he knows that their country loses it, but he would want to challenge it.
Right. Dennis McShane, just a little bit of housekeeping domestically before we look at the bigger picture again. And it's, you know, this thing kind of like expands and contracts as we discuss it. A no confidence vote. Is she going to survive it?
Yes, the Conservatives will all come running back around Mother this evening. They had their great outing yesterday. They had an outing before Christmas when they had, just inside the Conservative Party, a vote of no confidence, and 117 Tory MPs voted against her, and 118 Tory MPs voted against her yesterday. I assume they're the same people. She'll survive that. I mean, it really is weird to anybody who knows and loves British parliamentary history, the idea that a Prime Minister who suffered a 230 majority defeat, never before happened, just toddles along and poddles along as if nothing's changed, is really very, very weird indeed. Yep, she'll be there tomorrow. And her job, I slightly agree with Annie in Birmingham, is to find a way out. There are ways out. She could have proposed those 2.5 years ago. It's to say follow the Norway option. So we politically leave the EU. We're an independent sovereign state, but we still keep all the economic contacts and ties. The WTO line is silly. It takes a year or 2 years to negotiate going back into the WTO. And Russia and all of our friendly countries have made very clear they're not going to allow Britain back in on anything other than their terms. So the sensible way forward, if we can't have a second referendum, I prefer Parliament to take full control of this process, would be, as some sensible Conservatives have indicated, though, by the way, Ali, I don't think you'll find the liaison committee too many chairmen of, that's the committee of all the chairmen of all the big select committees, too many have said we're not touching this at all. It's down to Mrs May. She has to find it from within herself to reverse 2.5 years of being a hard Brexiter and come back into the middle of the picture.
But Stephen, given that she doesn't have the mandate in Parliament, yes, Dennis McShane said she'll probably survive the no confidence vote, but we look at the numbers from last night, 432 to 202. Should she be that person tasked with spearheading this big job now, or is she just a hollow shell of a leader who shouldn't be in the position?
I think she's severely weakened, and I believe she's been severely weakened over the past year and should have gone a long time ago and been replaced by somebody who truly believes in the benefits of Brexit. I mean, there's a lot that Dennis says there that I agree with, but there's no way that I could possibly agree that suggests that Theresa May is a hard Brexiteer. She's a Remainer at heart. She has tried to find a way that satisfies the Remain instincts of those who she has around her, whether it's David Lidington or Letwin, all her closest allies on that. She's tried to satisfy the Remainer attitudes of those in business who would rather be ruled by the European Union regulations than those in the UK. And it's that mistake that she has made fundamentally. Rather than saying, I trust the British people completely, and I follow the Brexit as they wanted, which is WTO followed by a free trade arrangement, she's tried to cobble this together. And sadly, that's where she's got the biggest mistake. But unfortunately, she isn't going anywhere. She'll be here to the very end.
Dennis McShane, tell me why you're shaking your head.
Well, very simply, when I voted, Steve and Annie, we all did, 30 months ago, the WTO wasn't on the ballot paper. Amputating economic links weren't on the ballot paper. Requiring all the British citizens in Europe to possibly have to come own wasn't on the ballot paper. It was leave or remain. And we were told by people like Boris Johnson and David Davis and others that there'd be no problems. Negotiating with the EU would take a matter of a few weeks. I mean, we had the most irresponsible, dishonest political campaign in history. Now, Mrs May, I agree, she isn't a sort of fanatical Brexiteer, but she's used, when you say that Europeans, my friends, living in my country, working and paying taxes, are queue jumpers, and when people who believe that we can support other nations are citizens of nowhere, that's ugly language. that I think has distressed an awful lot of people and meant she has very little political support. The way out, though, I do agree with Stephen. I don't think she's going anywhere. She's unbelievably stubborn. And were she to resign, there'd be an election in the Conservative Party, and we'd have an utterly fanatical European hater elected as leader, then presumably Prime Minister, and the crisis would deeply, deeply intensify.
Ali, as a Theresa May supporter, do you want her to continue to soldier on and be stubborn?
Absolutely. And I think you'll find that we have confidence in our Prime Minister. Of course, the deal didn't get through yesterday, but she's made it very clear she's willing to listen to what opposition MPs want. Where I think she did go wrong is that from the very beginning, she should have had a government of national unity. She should have brought together leaders from all the parties and sat down and actually found she should have found an agreement by this point that satisfies everybody's needs in Parliament. And she hasn't done that, but she is now aware that the only way she can get this through Parliament is if she does that. So I'm really hoping she does do that. But I have to go back on what Stephen said about WTO rules. Nobody ever voted to leave the European Union with no deal. Nobody voted.
Yes,
nobody voted for that specific thing because both campaigns, Remain and Leave, were based on the fact that we would leave with a deal. No one ever said anything about leaving without a deal. Nobody voted to be poor. Nobody voted to lose their jobs. It would be the worst case scenario, and I think MPs have a responsibility, MPs and MEPs have a responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen, because these are real lives we're talking about.
Stephen?
That is not, I'm sorry, but the very clear point was made to everybody in the election. From the £9 million leaflet that was sent to every house that said, if we leave the European Union, we leave the customs union and the single market. It was made very clear by the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister and the leaders of all parties that you will be leaving the single markets and customs union. And what we said in our campaign was very clear, that you leave those, that means, therefore, you are on WTO, and we seek to have a free trade arrangement. And our belief was a sensible government would have used the 2 years after the referendum to get a free trade arrangement. They've been blocked by Remainers. And Dennis, you cannot just turn around and say there were lies on our side without accepting the lies on yours. The Liberal Democrats have been fined for it. The language used by Remainers that have insulted people, calling them stupid, thick and idiotic for voting to leave, that has been highly divisive in our nation and deeply upsetting from MPs who use it all the time. And the suggestion they didn't know what they're voting for...
Okay, all right.
Finish your point, Stephen, and then Dennis can come in.
To suggest that people didn't know what they're voting for now is patronising beyond belief, and that has created the huge divide that we have in our country today.
Dennis?
No point in rerunning June, May 2016, or the 5, 10, 15 years before it. The biggest single slogan of the campaign was you'll have £350 million a week for the National Health Service on leaving the EU, on voting Brexit.
Good.
Hands up. Any of us, anybody in the world who thinks that was a truthful statement. But let's talk about tomorrow and next week and so on. What's going to happen? Possibly a second referendum. Yes, I'm a parliamentarian. I don't really like plebiscites. I think this plebiscite has it's like a giant tube of super glue that's been squeezed into all political machinery, government machinery, investment decision machinery, and everything's blocked up. And in the sense, a second referendum is the only way of cutting what's called a Gordian knot, I think. Now, I'm not sure what the outcome would be. Steve's side might win it again. Alternatively, we come to moderate, middle-of-the-road arrangements to maintain the economic relationship with the rest of Europe, to say to foreign investors, the 1,000-plus Japanese firms, if you stay in Britain, you can still export to 450 million middle-class consumers. If we go down the hard Brexit road, though, all that comes to a crashing end. So it's very, very tricky times, and it's down to leadership now. The idea MPs are taking back control. I was an MP for 20 years. You don't take back control. The people in charge are the party machines. Jeremy Corbyn is just sitting in the deck chair enjoying the Tory mess and chaos and crisis. And he's not prepared to offer much leadership, in my view, and I'm a Labour guy. Theresa May hasn't seen a blind alley she hasn't got up since July 2016. Let's see if this is finally wake-up time for her. I don't know, but it's going to be a very, very difficult period ahead for us.
Let's see. Well, we'll be having more discussions such as this one up until and including March 29th, 2019 and beyond, of course. Whether people were with the, 52% or the 48%, or they were ineligible to vote back then, 2.5 years ago, I guess a lot of people feel that we've hit a point where all the negotiations over the past 2 years have been for nothing. And that's a fascinating and interesting time now in the UK. We'll be keeping a close eye on it. But for the moment, gentlemen, I have to move on. Dennis McShane, Stephen Wolfe and Ali Fazil, thanks so much for joining us. Still to come on the program, explosions and gunfire ring out in Nairobi after 14 people were killed in an attack on a hotel. We ask if Shabab is resurgent in Kenya. And he's a president who promised to fight corruption. So why has Guatemala's Jimmy Morales thrown the UN's Corruption Commission out of the country? The Dusit Hotel complex in Nairobi is one of Kenya's most luxurious spots. But on Tuesday, it was the scene of a terror attack. Al-Shabab militants entered the compound with guns and bombs. It was the start of an almost 20-hour siege that killed at least 14 people. Kenya is part of a peacekeeping operation with Somalia to try and wipe out the terror group. But could their military operations abroad be making life at home less safe? Haider Abbasi explains.
Kenya's capital under attack. Explosions and gunfire. In an upmarket part of Nairobi, the gunmen filmed on security cameras.
So they're shooting from all over the place. Employees are running all over the place. People are screaming. Guys are trying to run out.
More than a dozen people were killed in the violence. The Somali group Al-Shabab says it carried out the assault. It began on Tuesday afternoon with an explosion outside a bank, followed by a suicide bombing in a nearby hotel. The militants then took control of the building. After a siege lasting about 19 hours, they were killed by Kenyan security forces.
We are grieving as a country this morning, and my heart and that of every Kenyan goes out to the innocent men and women violated by senseless violence.
Some Kenyans say the government should have been better prepared.
Security should have been beefed up since there was a warning that an attack was imminent. The government should have been more vigilant and not have waited for something to happen before getting serious.
This isn't the first time Al-Shabaab has targeted Kenya. In 2013, the militants attacked a mall, also in Nairobi, killing 67 people. After an 80-hour gunfight with security forces, the fighters were dead. 2 years later came the worst attack. Al-Shabaab killed 148 people at a university in the city of Garissa. Since 2011, Kenya has deployed its military to Somalia to help eliminate the group. Al-Shabaab once held the capital, Mogadishu, but was forced out after a campaign led by the African Union. But the group linked to Al-Qaeda remains a threat. It's believed to have up to 9,000 members and has imposed moral restrictions in places it controls. So should Kenya's government have been more prepared for such an attack? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. In London is counter-terrorism specialist David Otto, and in Drammen, Norway is Stig Jarle Hansen. He's the author of Al-Shabaab in Somalia, the history and ideology of a militant Islamist group. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. David Otto, let me start with you. Horrible attack, Is it clear to you that it actually was Al-Shabaab?
Of course, this is very clear that it carries all the hallmarks of Al-Shabaab, especially when one considers that the Garissa University attack of 2015 and the Westgate, attack of 2013, which led to the death of about 67 people. Al-Shabaab, when it carries out these kind of attacks, especially on hard targets, of course, there are a lot of civilian targets within this area, but this is a heavily fortified mall. When it carries out these kind of attacks, it would use 4 men, usually because they can fit into a vehicle. They would always use suicide tactics and AK-47. So this is exactly the kind of tactics that Al-Shabaab would use. So there is no doubt that this is Al-Shabaab as they claim it to be.
Yeah, Abdiaziz Abu Musab from Al-Shabaab told Reuters, we are behind the attack in Nairobi. The operation is going on. Stig, one of the things that David spoke about is the nature of the attack and also the target of the attack. Those are hallmarks of Al-Shabaab. Tell me, Stig, about the target, why they would choose 14 Riverside and why it would be so important to them.
No, I think, as was said by the previous speaker, that this is rather typical. 4 to 6 men. We are talking about targeting hotels. That's also very typical. Starting the attack with a suicide bomber. In the case of Kenya, targeting a hotel in an area where there's a lot of foreigners. I think essential in this planning is to try to hurt the Kenyans who are relatively dependent on the tourist industry. This creates uncertainty amongst some of the NGO workers that lives in that area, some of the press people that lives in that area, and some of the tourists that frequents to Kenya. And the foreign earnings generated by the tourist industry is very important in the Kenyan economy. So this is an attempt to hurt Kenya where it really hurts. And that's not only in the casualties that we see, not only in the people that die in the attack, but also in the aftermath. One of the interesting things to watch now is to see the travel advices from the countries that goes to Kenya and to see now if there's travel warnings, and that might hurt Kenya.
David, tactically on the ground, it went on for hours and hours. Could the authorities have done better and stopped it quicker?
Well, of course, the Westgate Mall attack in 2013 went on for about 80 hours. This attack, comparatively, is an improvement in terms of the response from the security services. We could see that there were overwhelmingly different departments of security services on ground. But when you look at the impact of their presence, it sounds more like motion without movement. Because these are just 4 men, and what the security services have been able to do is that they've been on ground on time, but it seems as if the actual coordination in terms of how to actually reach onto these assailants, wasn't actually helpful because again it took them more than 10 or 12 hours to finally get hold of these assailants. And even until this morning, there were still gunshots being heard within the area. So yes, the response was swift, but there is more to learn by the Kenyan security services. Deploying all security services, civilians, was also a very dangerous tactics that could backfire because Al-Shabaab could have easily deployed a secondary team, to infiltrate the security services that were on the ground.
And Stig, if you are the Kenyan government and you want to hit back, where do you fight them? Do you fight them in the forests between Kenya and Somalia? Do you fight them in urban centers where they might have different cells? Where do you actually find the enemy?
I would like to add and to disagree slightly with the previous speaker, though, because the target here was very complex. It's really hard to clear it out. And you can compare this with, for example, in the In Amenas attack in Algeria a couple of years ago. And it's actually hard to clear this compound. And I think the good thing about this attack was that it was much more coordinated. The reply from the Kenyan side was much more coordinated. I think, unfortunately for Kenya, the main battlefield in really defeating the Shabab is inside Somalia. Basically, the Shabab is taking advantage of a security vacuum in the Somali countryside, and also of AMISOM that sometimes bunker up in bases and don't provide security for the local population in the countryside, enabling the Shabab to pressure them for money and tax them. As long as this is not provided, as long as the Somalis themselves don't provide this, Shabab is here for the long run. Unfortunately for Kenya, they have this long border towards Somalia, and it's going to be hard to stop them all the time. Kenya has improved, but it's hard to stop them, and this problem has to be solved internally in Somalia. And Kenya has made a great effort, I would say, but it's beyond Kenya. It has to be regional cooperation, and it has to be progress on the ground inside Somalia that solves the Shabab issue.
David, do you agree with that? That no matter what Kenya does, fundamentally at the root of the problem is a Somali issue. Once Somalia is solved, Al-Shabaab will go away.
Of course, Somali is the, is the main source of Al-Shabaab. So therefore, it would be difficult for the Kenyans to solve this problem nationally without, helping Somalia to resolve the issue. Again, it is a regional collaboration, because even if, Somalia was assisted in resolving the problem, and if Kenya or the other African regional members, Ethiopia and Uganda, if they do not have a national robust strategy, what would happen is Al-Shabaab will simply move from Somalia into other regions. So the key, as the gentleman rightly said, is an effective regional collaboration. But this has to be based on internal dynamics, because, of course, Al-Shabaab comes from Somalia, but you still have sleeper cells within Uganda, within Ethiopia, and within Kenya itself. So it has to be a two-stage approach, in that sense.
Stig, a lot of people use this theory when it comes to Daesh. Whenever there's a terror attack, they say, well, these are the death throes of the group because they're weak, so they're lashing out. Is that similar with Al-Shabaab? Is this a sign of strength or weakness? Is this the death throes, or is it re-emergence?
I'm a little bit tired of the predictions of Shabab's death, because I've been working, studying the organization now since its inception. I've been studying it, in fact, since 2006. And each year you had this prediction of them dying. And I tell you now, they are not going to die. They're relatively stable. They're not on the increase. They're not on the decrease. They are stable. And as long as you don't bring security to the Somali countryside, it's not going to disappear in the future. They can stay there for the long duration. And as the gentleman before me said, there are fights to be taken inside Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and all these areas where Shabab has networks. But there have actually been progress, and a lot of the recruitment channels of the Shabab that they had in 2012, 2013 has been dismantled. There's still this vulnerable youth in Kenya. There's still this poor youth who has idols in the Islamic State and has idols in the Shabab. This problem hasn't been properly dealt with, but the Shabab command lines has successfully been targeted. So this the Shabab presence in Nairobi, I would say, it's much less now than it was, for example, 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, let me pick up on one of those things then. David, has Kenya failed to address the fact that young men are still joining them?
Of course, before I even go through that point, I think one thing we have to understand is Al-Shabaab is not stable. In terms of its capacity, it has actually increased. If you look at the rate at which they're carrying out their attacks and the impact of these attacks, and in addition to that, Al-Shabaab, as well as other Boko Haram organizations, they are benefiting a lot from some of the returning foreign fighters that came from the ruins of Raqqa and Mosul. So that is why they're having much more experienced fighters and advised. So I don't think, they are declining in terms of their capacity. What they are doing now is much more dangerous than what they used to do in 2006, in the sense that most of their attacks are targeted against, very hard to, what we call hard targets, where, fortification and security services are attacked. So Kenya has to work on that. They have to work on their community strategy, because if you look at the dynamics of these attacks, it tells you that there has been an intensive planning and preparation by this group. You know, they didn't just choose this particular place, out of, the blues. So the community has to understand how to report intelligence, and awareness as to, what these groups are carrying. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in Kenya, but more so, regional collaboration is important.
And Stig, who's collaborating with Al-Shabab? Who's helping them? Any groups?
I think Shabab has its friends like Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. These two organizations have been relatively close. But I also think that Shabab is actually self-sustained. They gather a lot of money from taxation in the countryside, from checkpoints and from trade inside Somalia. And also they gather some support from various mosques alongside the East African coast. So they have a lot of income generating possibilities. Their close allies, as I said, used to be Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, but both of these organizations are not able to support each other strategically. They can shelter each other, etc., discuss strategies, but huge support, moving of troops, that's impossible for them. I also think that Shabab has declined slightly from 2012, but for the 2 last years, it has probably risen slightly again. I think it's actually an organization that is standing stable, and there are heavy indications that the strategies so far have curtailed them, but they are not enough to defeat them. And I also I'm worried about Kenya when it comes to the trust between the police and the common person in the street. That has been poor in the past, and this is a factor that needs to improve for the Kenyans to really hit down on these youth groups that so far the Shabab hasn't really tapped into for the last 2 years, but they can tap into them in the future.
Yeah.
That's a danger that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, there was a really good Al Jazeera investigation a few years ago about alleged extrajudicial killings of especially ethnic Somali Kenyans in the country, and how that created some of the context for young people becoming radicalized. David Otto, innocent people killed, innocent guests to the country killed and injured. Do Kenyans have, I guess, a lot of cause for being really concerned right now that the Shabab threat is greater or as great as it ever has been?
What the Kenyans would have to bear in mind is that the government has to be lucky all the times. Groups like Al-Shabab, have to just be lucky once. In the words of the chief of IRA, Sean McStuffin, the Kenyans have to work in collaboration. I mean, and we talk about multi-agency approach led by the community. This is what Kenyans have to understand, because it is the ordinary citizens that suffer the most. They are the ones without the guns. They are the ones who have to run away the most when there is an attack. So I think what the government has to do is to assist them in terms of creating awareness, but also removing some of those, very easy drivers that would force people to collaborate and coordinate with some of these movements. Again, terrorist attacks are intelligence-led. So whoever gets the intelligence, gets the upper hand. The government has to work on that intelligence. They have to work with their communities in order for them to have a safer environment. Without that, Al-Shabaab would prosper. And, even if they carry out attacks once every 3 years, it is still bad for the government.
Right.
Even if the government reacts on time, it is still not good enough for those who have been killed.
David Otto and Stig Jarle Hansen, it's been good to have you both on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
They want to maintain their corrupt and lawless regime, and the lack of governance has been steadily increasing year after year. We have seen how this corruption really affects the poorest, which is the reason for the increase in migration.
Guatemala's president, Jimmy Morales, was once a stand-up comedian. Then in 2015, he ran for president with the slogan, "Not corrupt, nor a thief." And he won. So it was almost funny when a UN-backed anti-corruption commission investigated him for campaign finance violations. But for the president, it was anything but a joke, and he's fighting back. Morales announced he was ousting the UN body known as CICIG and gave its foreign staff 24 hours to leave the country. The decision led to protests demanding his resignation. So is Guatemala's democracy under threat? To discuss that, let's speak to Jim Loughran from Dublin. He's worked in Guatemala with Frontline Defenders, a group that protects human rights actors at risk. Jim, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Does Morales have something to hide?
I think what the only surprising thing in the current crisis in Guatemala is that it didn't erupt sooner, because over the last 10 years, Frontline Defenders has been documenting a consistent pattern of human rights abuses, meaning human rights defenders who were smeared by officials, including the president himself, where the legal system has been co-opted by criminal and corporate interests, and where a large section of the population feel abandoned by the government. We have to remember, for example, that in Guatemala, something like 70% of the land in the country is owned by 6% of the population. So a huge number of people feel disenfranchised and that the government doesn't speak for them. And corruption, government corruption is at the heart of that issue.
Might that be true? And at the same time, might it also be true that CICIG prosecutors might have overstepped their mandate, and that's why he's going after them?
It's very clear that CICIG and the Commissioner Vasquez have been made the kind of fall guys in the government's campaign to stay in office and to maintain power. I had a meeting with Commissioner Vasquez when I was in Guatemala, and he explained that they work very closely with the Attorney General's office and with the Human Rights Ombudsman, and that they can only intervene in cases where there is a clear pattern of wrongdoing. And he has been very strong in defense of the work of CICIG, and that's why we're seeing protests on the street today, that a high proportion of the human rights defenders and the citizens of Guatemala want an end to the corruption, where a small elite maintains power, controls the government, and resists any process of reform.
And the court said you can't kick Velázquez out and you have to allow him back in. Morales said, no, I can. So what does that mean about the independence of the court system in the country?
That is the key issue, and I touched on it earlier when I said that the legal system has been co-opted by vested interests. The Constitutional Court has ruled on numerous occasions that Vasquez himself should be allowed to return to the country, that CICIG, the Commission Against Impunity and Corruption, should be allowed to continue its work. And in the end of the day, the question is whether Guatemala is a state of law or whether it is governed at the whim of a powerful elite. And it's no coincidence, for example, that in the photo call during which Jimmy Morales announced the expulsion of CICIG, that he was backed by a phalanx of high-ranking military officers. And what many people fear is that what we're seeing today is, in effect, a soft coup.
Did he only start to take on the UN-backed inquiry after his brother and son were implicated in fraud allegations?
Yeah, that has been a trigger, but this has been brewing for some time, where we've seen, for example, the former president and vice president prosecuted for corruption. We have seen, for example, that a third of the members of Congress have corruption charges pending against them. And possibly the problem for Vasquez is that he stepped on the toes of some very rich, very powerful people who've been in power for a very long time and who are simply not willing to share that power. And it's interesting, for example, that the demonstrations are being led by an organization called Godeca, which is a peasant organization. 7 of their members were murdered last year. And the reason is, there are 3 reasons. One is that they have very strong leaders, that they have the ability to mobilize nationally, and they have expressed their intention of moving into the political domain. So Jimmy Morales and his allies see Codeca and their partner organizations as both a threat and a target.
And given that CICIG had exposed Otto Perez Molina and that led to him resigning, That was in 2015, so we're talking 3.5 years ago. Has all the good work been undone in the past few months?
I think what we see is that there's a very clear choice facing both the government of Guatemala and the international community. And we should emphasize here also that the responses from Washington have been extremely weak, where they haven't responded on the detail of the move against CICIG and have simply reiterated their thanks for the government's work against corruption and impunity. But it is corruption and impunity. Corruption in Guatemala has been described as being the operating system of the state, and where the line between government administration and state functions and organized crime is so blurred as to be almost invisible. And unless that issue is addressed head on, unless the reforms that have been achieved with a huge amount of work are built on, then the future for democracy and human rights is really very just depressing almost. And in fact, in all the meetings I had during the recent mission to Guatemala with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN delegations, the EU delegations, they all accepted the basic premise that the work of CICIG, the work of the Human Rights Ombudsman, and the work of the Constitutional Court was the last line of defense for democracy in Guatemala. And that's something we really have to take very seriously.
So if Washington's response is something more than the current tepidness that it is, will it make a difference?
Money talks, and in the end of the day, what some of the human rights defenders in Guatemala are calling for is that the United States, for example, should suspend all non-humanitarian aid until such times as the government agrees to abide by the rule of law and to implement the recommendations of CICIG for reform. And I think we have to remember where this crisis is coming from. Guatemala experienced a brutal civil war in which thousands of people were killed. And the UN and the government itself, the government of Guatemala and other members of the international community have acknowledged that the ongoing human rights crisis in Guatemala is rooted in the fact that they failed to deal with the issue of impunity, that human rights abuses, that killings can take place without anyone being held to account. And that is at the root of many of the problems. And it is this the failure to deliver justice, the failure to deliver economic reform, and a failure to deliver a future for the citizens of Guatemala that's driving people from Guatemala to head for the border of the United States. And if President Trump wants to deal with the issue of immigration, then maybe he needs to start looking a little bit closer to the ground in Guatemala and Honduras and neighboring countries.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. If somebody can make the argument to Trump that if you're worried about the migrant caravan, maybe you should address it at the root. But that's for a broader discussion, I guess. And we're out of time, Jim. But it's been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Jim Loughran, thanks for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, is Lebanon's economy on the brink of collapse? Protesters say the government has stolen much-needed funds. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.